Who are a few people we never thought would do crime? Let's find out, starting with number 6. It wasn't hair powder. Jade Hughes was a hairdresser who made a little more money by selling a bit of extra stuff on the side. You know, that sort of extra stuff that makes the DEA all upset and come after you with sniffing dogs and whatnot. She ran this side business with her boyfriend. Hughes was very proud of the product she sold, and she often boasted that its quality would leave people extremely active. Things were going swimmingly for her and her boyfriend, but their jolly ride came to an end when 2 of Jade's phones were seized during a search of another house during an unrelated probe. The phones led the police to Hughes, and her home was raided. The raid proved that Hughes was involved in the illicit trade of contraband, and she was hauled into court. The police found a hoard of product paraphernalia, including 2 digital weighing scales, disposable plastic glove fingers used to bag up products, and 2 mobile phones that were probably used to arrange deliveries, purchases, and sales. Police caught Hughes by going through the confiscated phones and discovering a bunch of slang that could only be referring to illegal substances. This search led to the arrest of Hughes and her boyfriend, and the couple pled guilty to supply of Class A products. Yes, including the most egregious types. Was sentenced to 52 months in prison, while her boyfriend only got 32 months. In court, Hughes said that she was very sorry for her involvement in the trade. She said that she was from a decent home and was raised by both parents and grandparents. She had even gone to a local college where she studied for a level 3 qualification in hairdressing. Life. From then on, she lost her way and then got into the product business after building up debt as a user. It's clear from her testimony that she didn't really have to go into crime and could have easily had a better life. It just goes to show that major crimes don't always come from poverty and rough lives. We can only hope that Hughes will choose another path when she finishes her sentence. Number 5. Arrested relationship. NYPD officer Rony Santiago was in deep trouble after getting sued by Kammie Sifonte for his extreme and outrageous conduct. Now, you may wonder what sort of extreme and outrageous conduct an NYPD officer may display towards a citizen. It starts with an arrest. Officer Santiago arrested Kammie Sifonte for shoplifting at Target. That's a pretty run-of-the-mill crime, and ended in Kammie being released from the police station after a short holding period. It should have ended there if Officer Santiago was a normal police officer. But he wasn't, and it didn't. Santiago copied Kammie's phone number off her files and started texting her barely 20 minutes after she left the station. According to Kammie, the first few texts were aggressive, but not vulgar. She said they made her uncomfortable, but she replied because she was afraid Santiago would retaliate or make things worse for her with her criminal case. But then, the messages Officer Santiago sent slowly became more and more vulgar. Santiago started sending explicit messages about how he wanted horizontal favors from Kammie and started building from there. Among other graphically inappropriate texts, he said his MO was to flirt with attractive women that he arrested. His messages continued to get more vulgar, with Officer Santiago eventually threatening to show up at Kammie's home for dinner, which is obviously just weird and awkward behavior for anyone, let alone a cop. Fortunately, Kammie got legal help and sued the NYPD for over $25,000 for Officer Santiago's conduct. We expect the police to protect us, not put us in a position that we need to be protected from them. The police have a tough enough job as it is, and they're under a microscope now more than ever. So this was the last thing the department needed. Do you have any weird stories where someone wouldn't leave you alone? Let us know in the comments below. Number 4. Bad banker. Najib Khan orchestrated one of the largest check-kiting schemes ever in U.S. history and used the proceeds of that crime to live like a king. He had a ridiculous fleet of 240 luxury cars, a private jet, a helicopter, a boat, and properties in the choicest locations in the country. Khan did all this while building a legitimate payroll processing business in Indiana. And before even starting the payroll processing company, he had retired from a bank as the vice president. So it's not like this guy wasn't already making a pretty decent living as it was. But greedy people do greedy things, and Mr. Khan was greedy, so he stole anyway. By the time Khan was done ripping Cleveland's Key Bank off, the company had a $120 million hole in its balance sheet, a hole that the bank had to deploy over 100 staff members to fix. The fraud was so gigantic that the bank had to fire some key staff who had allowed it all to happen. Khan didn't carry out the fraud all at once. He did it meticulously over 7 years. So how did Khan's check-kiting scam work? Well, in 2011, Khan started embezzling money from KeyBank by writing bad checks back and forth between bank accounts he controlled to artificially inflate their balances while the checks were being processed. He'd then cash out those accounts while the checks were still pending, and the bank would be left holding the bag with no money. And Khan did all of this through his payroll business. Khan's victims are too numerous to mention. All his clients, from small businesses to churches and even the Boy Scouts of America, got fleeced. When the scam eventually collapsed, over 1,700 clients lost out on money Khan's company had withdrawn for payroll taxes. This meant that the clients had to make up the difference by paying their employees out of pocket, paying the IRS, and taking out credit lines to sustain their businesses. Some were even forced to lay off their employees. Thankfully, Khan wasn't allowed to get away with it. He was eventually caught and made to pay for his crimes. He's now been sentenced to 8 years in prison and has sold an overwhelming majority of his properties to cover restitution. The court ordered him to pay back $121 million to KeyBank, $27 million to clients, and $9.8 million in back taxes. So far, $65 million has been paid back, and all his 240 cars have been sold to fund that restitution. Now Khan only has his 2005 GMC Yukon, but he won't have a lot of time to drive it since he's in jail. But it's not all sad news for Khan. Under a special agreement with creditors, his wife will retain the couple's $1.1 million Michigan home and $650,000 guest house, several vehicles, a retirement fund, and several bank accounts. So thank heavens the criminal will get to keep some of his lifestyle. We know you were worried. Khan will also keep his retirement account. Since he was 70 at the time he was sentenced, we predict he'll want access to those funds immediately. Number 3, exploiting the homeless. The Multnomah County Sheriff's Office in Portland, Oregon, has arrested Kevin Dahlgreen for theft and misconduct. Mr. Dahlgreen is a really popular online personality known for his viral videos on homelessness. However, Dahlgreen has now been slammed with 19 different charges, including identity theft and official misconduct. The incredible thing is that before his arrest, Dahlgreen was a model citizen. Some officials praised his videos on homelessness, and because they showed how really severe the homelessness crisis really is. However, other service providers claimed that he was sensationalizing the dangers of homelessness for his own selfish gain. Dahlgreen had previous work experience as a homeless service provider, so he was in tune with the problem and knew what causes to highlight through his sometimes controversial videos. Through this, he drew attention from both right and left-wing media, with popular outlets like the New York Post and Fox News featuring his videos. Dahlgreen's videos don't just show homeless people and the extent of their suffering. He also showed their problems to their substances and how that contributed to even more homelessness in the city. He's been very critical of service providers who he says contribute to the illegal substance problems that homeless people deal with. Dahlgreen's work has been so important that the Deschutes County Sheriff's Office paid him $18,000 to produce his study on homelessness. However, when the 6-page report was done, Dahlgreen's critics said it was full of misinformation and appeared unprofessional. So, how did this homeless advocate, who appeared to be doing so well for himself, end up in police custody? Well, the charges themselves are unclear at the time this video is being made. But we do know that Kevin used the identities of several homeless people to defraud the city of Gresham during the coronavirus pandemic. It's so ironic that the homeless population that Dahlgreen was supposed to be serving ended up forming the bulk of his victims. Of course, this has made investigation into the extent of the fraud difficult, since Dahlgreen's victims have no permanent address and can be hard to find. Number 2, the Traitor. Josie McLaughlin stole the life savings of a widow, but somehow escaped jail time. She was hired as a helper for 84-year-old Mrs. Ann Sharp and her late husband. Soon, McLaughlin and Mrs. Sharp became extremely close. In fact, McLaughlin was so close to Mrs. Sharp that Mrs. Sharp actually referred to her as a long-lost daughter. And despite being treated like a daughter, McLaughlin still decided to rob Mrs. Sharp of everything she had. McLaughlin drained the widow's savings account of every penny it had. For over 15 months, McLaughlin stole up to 700 pounds from Mrs. Sharp every week by forging fake checks in Mrs. Sharp's name. Since Mrs. Sharp was an elderly woman whose mental awareness was on the decline, she didn't notice the stealing until all her money was gone. And when Mrs. Sharp did eventually discover the missing money, she asked McLaughlin for an explanation. Mrs. Sharp, by pretending to call the police and bank, asked for explanations. Thankfully, McLaughlin couldn't get away with her crime forever. Detectives discovered that she had already been jailed for fraud back in 2019 after she was caught stealing from a charity in precisely the same manner. McLaughlin said that she had financial difficulties due to relationship issues and was using Mrs. Sharp's money to stay afloat. But that didn't really hold much water since McLaughlin was staying afloat in a pretty affluent neighborhood in the UK. In court, McLaughlin faced up to 4 years in prison, but was sentenced to just 2 years with the entire sentence suspended, which is basically probation. It seems a bit outrageous that she got a little more than a slap on the wrist, but that was only possible because Mrs. Sharp herself had written to the magistrate and asked him not to impose a sentence. This is a good time to double check and keep on keeping a close eye on your loved ones who are being watched over by a caregiver. Scammers can come from anywhere at any time. If you're enjoying this video, be sure to stay tuned right here to find out how this seemingly trusting employee embezzled millions from the owners. Number 1. The crime lawyer. Normally, when you think of a lawyer, you think they'd be on the right side of the law. Not Linda Haddad. She basically committed all types of crimes. Well, not like all the types of crimes, but definitely a significant bunch. She loved her nose beers. She slept with clients and even had, let's just say, some real sultry talk over the phone with inmates she was supposed to be representing in court. Linda was living her best life. She wasn't the greatest lawyer ever or anything, but she got regular clients and paid her bills on time. That was before she decided to dabble in the dark arts, like Grindelwald, but like without all the genocidal ambitions. When she was eventually caught by the authorities, Linda admitted to basically doing everything. She has had inappropriate contact with her clients multiple times, spoke to them about using illegal substances to get active in the bedroom, and one time she even rented a vehicle for a dealer who paid her in his product. She also admitted to being an extremely heavy user of illegal products. This led to her being disbarred in the state of Florida. The incredible thing is that this isn't Linda's first descent into the dark side. She's been arrested 5 times before. Once for driving under the influence, and 4 other times for vehicle registration issues. But none of those crimes are as serious as the ones she's now pled guilty to committing. The good news, we guess, is that Linda has managed to not get arrested since that incident and is hopefully now living a way better life. You never expect to hear about people who do all this work to become a lawyer and then build a successful practice only to throw it all away for nothing. Hopefully she stays on the right path. Sandy Jenkins spent years saving up for a new car and was still nowhere near his goal. The accountant currently working at Collins Street Bakery was staring at his computer screen at the blank spaces on his company's checks when inspiration hit him. On a whim, he drove to the Dallas Lexus dealership and bought a gold Lexus sedan with a tan leather interior. Although he sold his old Lexus as a down payment, he couldn't afford the monthly cost of his new vehicle. But he had a plan and swiped his card. Sandy drove home blasting music as he flew down the highway. He was sure people were looking at him in envy, and when he got home, he told his wife that the car was a gift from the Fishers, a couple he'd been helping with their accounting. According to an article in Texas Monthly, a few weeks later, his credit card payment was due. He checked to see that nobody was looking as he entered a $20,000 check in the accounting software payable to CitiCard. Sandy printed the check, which automatically added CEO Bob McNutt's signature, then voided it in the system so there would be no record. Sandy then took the check and paid off his car. He smiled to himself. This was going to be fun. Sandy Jenkins was a shy accountant who was tired of feeling unnoticed. Every morning, he awoke before his alarm, made a strong cup of coffee, had breakfast with his wife, and watched Good Morning America. He spent his 10-minute morning commute daydreaming about the life of luxury he never had. Sandy worked at the Collins Street Bakery, where he felt invisible. He silently admired Bob McNutt, the beloved CEO who ran the bakery. Coworkers only visited Sandy to talk about payroll reports, sales reports, and other administrative work, but they sure loved talking to Bob. Sandy had worked at the bakery for 6 years and still needed to save up money to buy the upgraded Lexus he wanted. Sandy and his wife Kay might not have been wealthy, but they lived a good life. They had refined tastes and lived in a nice neighborhood. Their home was well kept, and neighbors commented on their manicured front yard. Sandy spent his evenings with his wife, who would cook while he played classical music on the piano. Sandy's shyness defined most of his social interactions, stemming back to his school days. He was quiet and only had a few friends, and worked at his family's grocery store after school and on weekends. Accounting wasn't Sandy's first passion. He wanted to work as a funeral director, but that's not exactly what drew him to the career. Funeral directors wore sharp outfits, drove immaculate black cars, were eloquent, and worked in the rich backdrops of funeral homes. When Sandy told his father about his dream occupation, his dad discouraged him and suggested he go for a more mainstream career. Sandy decided to get a degree in business administration from Dallas Baptist University. He met Kay at the college after a family friend told him about her niece, who occasionally needed a ride to campus. Sandy picked Kay up from her aunt's house, and the two drove to class together. He couldn't believe his luck and eventually persuaded her to marry him. Jenkins' first job out of college was as an accounting clerk at a utility company in Fairfield, but he was much more interested in living in Corsicana. They moved to the wealthy town when Jenkins' company transferred him close enough. People in Corsicana loved to gossip, making it a place where everybody was in on one another's business. When the Jenkins arrived in 1988, they had some catching up to do. And how were they ever going to get in with the upper crust of Corsicana society? A few years after settling in the town, struggling to make ends meet, and spending a lot of time volunteering at their church, Sandy landed a job at the most famous employer around. Collins Street Bakery sold premier fruitcakes, and since Sandy loved fruitcakes, it was the perfect fit. Not only was the bakery the best-known business in Corsicana, but it was the world's most renowned purveyor of fruitcakes. Bob McNutt ran the bakery, which had been in his family for generations. He'd recently expanded it, opening storefronts in places like Waco, Lindale, and Greenville. Sandy joined the company as an accounts payable and payroll supervisor in the same year as the expansion. He made $25,000 a year and had spent $1,000 of the bakery's money on an antique desk reproduction for his new office. Sandy was one of the company's top performers and transitioned the bakery from a manual accounting system to a computerized one. His supervisor raved about Jenkins' hard work and how he completed every task on time. In 2000, Sandy received a promotion to corporate controller. The Jenkinses did well for themselves. Sandy had a good job, they'd raised a daughter, attended church, and were contributing community members. But their accomplishments were meaningless in a town that noticed everything one another did. And in a place that only cared about money and familial wealth, couple never truly fit in. Despite the promotion, Sandy dreamed of making more money. He had big plans, like joining the Corsicana Country Club, a gourmet group, or a wine society. Everyone who was anyone belonged to a supper club, many going back for generations. The Jenkins weren't members of fancy clubs. They were the people that made food down at the church. People in Corsicana only noticed that the couple didn't wear the right name brand clothing and that Kay didn't look after herself and get plastic surgery like the other women. Despite all his hard work, Sandy was still an outsider looking in. He wanted a change. Everyone in town was loaded, but Sandy was doing the work of 3 people and feeling as though his employer barely paid him anything. He was tired of waiting to live out his dreams, and his present job wasn't really doing much to get him there. One day, Sandy helped himself to some of the bakery's petty cash. It wasn't a lot, but enough to stress him out if someone noticed. Except, nobody did notice. He dreaded the moment someone would enter his office and ask where the cash went, but that day never came. So, he decided to drive to the Lexus dealer and purchase the newer gold model he had dreamed about. After the day when Sandy paid his credit card bill with a $20,000 check from the bakery, he was hooked. He waited until he was confident that nobody noticed the first fraudulent check. He went on to repeat his scheme. Kay and and Sandy were soon spending $98,000 on their credit card, paid for by Collins Street Bakery. They remodeled their kitchen into the perfect entertaining space with high-end appliances, cooling and warming drawers, and granite countertops. The couple hosted elaborate dinner parties where they opened $100 bottles of wine and served steaks and veal chops. They joined multiple supper clubs, hosted champagne brunches, and fully integrated with Corsicana's exclusive social scene. Part of fitting in was looking the part. Although Sandy told people at work that he bought his outfits from Walmart, he was actually wearing $600 from designer brands like Armani and Hermes. He filled his closet with expensive shoes like Ferragamos and Gucci's, and had a personal shopper at Neiman Marcus. Sandy was also obsessed with expensive watches. He'd always admired them at Neiman Marcus, and in December 2006, he purchased 5 Rolexes worth $52,765, a little over his current annual salary. The home in Corsicana also wasn't enough anymore. When Sandy was on a trip to Santa Fe, he bought a $658,000 4-bedroom adobe house. Sandy and Kay invited their upper-class friends from Corsicana to visit, sending them on a private jet and treating them to expensive wines and dinners. And Santa Fe wasn't their only vacation spot. They also traveled by jet to Aspen, Napa, and Martha's Vineyard. A year after the first fraudulent check, Sandy had taken 43 private flights costing $500,000. However, he told anyone who asked that he had a generous cousin who loaned him planes. It was only a matter of time before the town started talking. Sandy's sudden change in financial status was obvious in a town that loved gossip. The couple got ahead of rumors by telling people around town they had inherited money, although sometimes their stories were inconsistent. By this point, the gold Lexus was long gone, and the couple kept purchasing the newest Lexus, BMW, and Mercedes-Benz models. Sandy told a co-worker he was a car trader, but mentioned to others that the same cousin who loaned him planes also let him borrow cars. Kay knew that Sandy didn't have a cousin with a private jet. She quit her job shortly after he sent the first check, but made efforts to keep extravagant purchases discreet. Kay ordered a 2-seat Lexus convertible in peacock blue, the same color as her previous car, so as not to draw too much attention. When it arrived in midnight blue instead, she sent it back. But she couldn't stop neighbors from noticing the flashy cars in the driveway. Back at the bakery, Bob McNutt didn't understand why the bakery wasn't profitable. He feared they'd expanded too quickly, but couldn't find a specific part of the business that was losing money. To identify the issue, McNutt examined their expenses, looking into labor, inventory, payroll, and more. He didn't realize Sandy had timed his checks so well that he was undetectable. Sandy knew when the bakery was making large purchases for things like ingredients and would pad those expense areas. Since those expenses would typically be high, nothing would seem off when the bakery ran its marketing analysis. Sandy's social climb was as safe as it could be. Kay wasn't as good at mingling with the town socialites as she wanted to be. She often asked awkward questions, like inquiring how much money she would need to fit into Corsicana society. Despite their unusual social interactions, the couple enjoyed their new luxurious life. They preferred only the best food and drink, enjoying bottles of expensive champagne and dining on Petrosian caviar. They were jetting off to Santa Fe, Napa, or Martha's Vineyard when they weren't entertaining. They took over 223 trips on private jets, with their travel costs exceeding $3.3 million. Sandy's splurges grew even more extravagant, with him purchasing a $7,200 cell phone, a $58,000 Steinway piano, and a $40,000 horsehair mattress. The couple no longer went to church, as they felt the parishioners were still treating them as mere kitchen workers. Instead, Kay became the treasurer of the Quintillion Book Club, and Sandy joined a wine club. The couple was living the dream. Sandy felt invincible. Other people might have been paranoid about getting caught, but he never considered cashing out. Sandy Jenkins was no longer invisible, and that was all that mattered. In June 2013, Symmetric Walker, a new hire in accounting, came into Sandy's office. She found a check made out to Capital One and was confused as the bakery didn't have accounts or credit cards with Capital One. She asked Sandy to help her understand it, and he said he'd look into it. He hoped panic didn't show on his face, but it did. Symmetric had a gut feeling about Sandy and snuck into his office when he was out for the afternoon. She looked through the voided check register and immediately found 11 discrepancies that were worth $400,000. She reported him to the upper-level executives who were ready to confront him the next day at work. Sandy's boss showed him the voided checks and asked for an explanation. At first, Sandy shrugged it off, acting like he'd done nothing wrong. But Sandy wasn't good on his feet and couldn't offer a logical explanation, other than to say that he wrote checks for the bakery, a response that made almost no sense. So they fired him, and he fled. He rushed home, taking 2 grocery bags from the kitchen and filling them with handfuls of valuable items from throughout the house, like watches, jewelry, and gold bars. He got in one of his cars with Kay, and they raced out of town. When Collins Street Bakery spoke about Sandy's 9 years of embezzlement, they claimed claimed that a company of their age often saw fluctuations in growth, with some years better than others. The bakery was having troubles at the time as customers' views of their chief and most popular product, fruitcake, were changing for the worse. Leadership was busy worrying about overcoming the public's growing distaste for fruitcake and finding ways to generate new interest in it. They were preoccupied with marketing and advertising efforts. Sandy covered his tracks by manipulating the books to make it look like the profit decrease was due to a marketing campaign failure. He was the person that approved claims and signed the checks, meaning nobody was checking his work. The more the company spent on marketing, easier it was for Sandy to embezzle. When leadership finally confronted him about the voided checks, Sandy had embezzled $16.7 million, with $16,649,786 in checks and $114,342 in cash. The incremental amounts Sandy took weren't enough to damage the bakery's immediate profits. Even though senior management knew they were losing money, they never thought to look at anyone but themselves. The news didn't hit the town until a month later, when the FBI showed up at the Jenkins home. The town flocked to the property to see a swarm of cars and officers searching the house. Locals gathered around to gossip and watch a tow truck arrive for the couple's multiple vehicles, and officers carried out boxes of furs, wine, and other high-end items. Sandy and his wife, who were definitely no longer invisible, were still out of town. Sandy had gathered his jewelry, dumped it in a Whole Foods bag, and frantically scattered it behind trees, bushes, and rocks at a local park. He also ditched his luxury watches and gold bars, hiding some in the bushes and dumping the rest in a lake. However, an off-duty police officer just happened to stumble across $250,000 of the luxury items. Federal authorities sent a scuba team to search the lake, and the FBI linked the items' serial numbers to Sandy's record. The FBI knocked on the Jenkins doors a few days later and indicted him on counts of money laundering, mail fraud, other related offenses. The couple hadn't just stolen checks and cash. They ran up $11 million in charges on American Express cards. And if you're enjoying this video and think Sandy was way too quick to go to prison, be sure to stay tuned right here for our past release to find out what this guy did from the FBI. The Jenkins estate sale was a big event in Corsicana. People started lining up at the house hours before the doors opened. Organizers let guests enter in small groups to see the Jenkins extravagance in person. The house had designer handbags, wallets, luggage, briefcases, collector pens, jewelry, and more. Bob McNutt handed out Collins Street Bakery treats to everyone in line, encouraging them to spend as much money as possible when they got inside. He needed to make back his $17 million, and the sale was his best shot. Everyone speculated about Sandy's motivation, and the gossip didn't stop. Some said he was bitter that Bob had the life Sandy dreamed of, while others believed he just wanted to feel like a big shot. The conclusion was that Sandy and Kay wanted to be a part of Corsicana society, but needed more money. Despite his efforts, Sandy couldn't spare Kay from punishment, though her sentence was far more lenient than his. Sandy received 10 years in a federal detention facility, and Kay got 5 years probation. Sandy's prison routine returned to something similar to his life before the embezzlement. He woke up, drank his coffee, and ate breakfast while watching Good Morning America, but instead of dreaming about an extravagant and social future, he reminisced about his past luxurious life. Sandy passed away in 2019, 4 years into his 10-year sentence. Click to watch one of these next videos. Let us know in the comment section what you'd rather have: a police force that can 100% accurately predict crime and arrest criminals before it happens, or have things the way they are now.